This story happened a couple of years ago. The main character of the story is John. Back then, a 27-year-old single male living alone in a studio apartment in one of the biggest cities in my country. This has relevance later on. To begin, I will describe what kind of person John was. John grew up with his grandparents because his mother was an addict and his father, also his mother's dealer, died of an overdose while John's mother was pregnant with him. John lived with his grandparents until the age of 24, and then got kicked out because he apparently stole a large sum of money from them. This was very easy to believe because later on we also had a couple of incidents with him taking things that didn't belong to him. John also always wanted to one-up you with everything. He could do anything better, faster, more efficient, and so on. He also lived in a fantasy where he had a very important role in everything he associated himself with, and he lived like he had all the money in the world, but in reality, he regularly had to sell his stuff to afford food. Now, how I met John. I met John at a local gaming center. We both played the Pokemon trading card game. Everybody warned me from the beginning about him, what kind of person he was, but I didn't give it much of a thought. A year went by with several minor incidents with him not really worth mentioning here, until one day the first real red flag appeared. I just missed my bus after going shopping for some gaming supplies. The next bus was an hour or so it was quite the wait. I sat on the bench by the bus stop scrolling through Facebook when I suddenly heard a voice calling my name. It was John. He asked me what I was doing there, and I told him so. Then he suggested for me to come to his apartment to play some games to kill the time. John wasn't my first choice of person whom I wanted to spend my time with, but I figured it was better than waiting all alone. At his apartment, we played some games for actually more than 2 hours. Nothing weird happened until I decided to leave his place. I stood up and said that I had had a great time, but really had to go now. John suddenly out of nowhere lunges to his door, locks it, and throws the keys in his closet. I said, "Well, John, I told you I have to go, so just open the freaking door so I can leave." He refused, and when I wanted to grab the keys from his closet, he took his katana, which he also had lying around, and pointed it at me, saying I wasn't leaving. As I'm a male myself, I didn't feel threatened by him and said, "What are you going to do, man? Kill me? Well, go ahead. You won't get that far." We had a stare down for a couple of seconds until he decided to lower his katana and open the door so I could leave. I felt very confused afterwards why he suddenly acted like that. But then I received a DM from him telling me he was just fooling around with me and to not take anything that happened seriously. So I did that since he always appeared weird and unpredictable to me anyway. This was the first incident with him acting weird that was worth mentioning because of what is to come now. Now for the main story and why you're all here. This happened a couple of months ago after the katana incident. John regularly went to anime conventions, and that is where he met a girl which he later invited via Facebook to come to his apartment to trade Pokemon figurines. On the day of the meetup, the girl, according to John, ghosted him and he was very mad about it. She also never came back home and her parents filed a missing person report. This was very strange for her to just vanish, and a search for her was started. 2 days later, our group went to meet up at the gaming center to play the Pokemon trading card game. John didn't show up, which was very unusual for him because he has never missed a meetup before. I asked around where John was, and someone told me that he was at the police station to take a statement about the missing girl. We all joked about knowing John that he would make himself suspicious and would probably argue with the cops so that they would keep him at the station for the night. That evening further passed uneventful, and I went home to sleep. The next morning was the day when the bomb got dropped on me. I woke up to a dozen of texts from my friends with links to news articles related to that missing girl. Apparently John's alibi had a lot of gaps, and he said a lot of contradictory things to the cops, which made him a suspect in the case. The police ordered a search warrant for John's apartment, and that is where they discovered the whole truth. Entering John's apartment, the cops found bloodstains on his carpet and some loose dirt coming from his backyard. I can guess you already know where this is going, and yes, indeed they found the girl's body in a shallow grave in John's backyard. The girl was naked and bound up. Later autopsy revealed the girl was strangled to death and had been brutally violated as well. They found John's DNA in her. The cops also found camera footage from the girl and John entering his apartment that fateful day, only for her to never leave again. Confronting John with the evidence, he still claimed he didn't know what happened that day and that the girl just didn't show up. John kept claiming to be innocent for the following 2 years while locked up waiting for his trial. At his trial, the further dark side of John was revealed. While investigating the murder, the cops searched John's phone and laptop and found he was active on online forums and chat logs. Those were forums and chat logs with other men discussing how they got off on strangling and violating women. John was also a huge fan of things like this and openly discussed his fantasies on those sites. In one of the conversations, John confessed to another man about how he dreams of kidnapping 13-year-old girls only to keep them as slaves in a dog cage and torture them daily. The dog cage he was talking about and various other toys were found during the search of his apartment, so I guess one day he would have gone through with his plans. A psychiatrist examined John and diagnosed him with primary psychopathy and antisocial and narcissistic personality disorder. The test concluded that the chances of him acting on his fantasies again are very high, and he will always be a danger to society. Finally, his trial had come to a conclusion. The jury found him guilty of everything in the first degree, and he got the maximum punishment for which is life in prison or 30 years of incarceration in my country. Also, while John was locked up, he attacked his cellmate and tried to violate and kill him as well. This is currently under investigation, and an additional punishment will be added to his sentence for that crime. The moral of the story is to never know someone fully and to never fully assume you know what's going on in a person's mind. Also, never meet up at someone's place if you don't know them very well. Meet up at a public place instead. This tragedy could have been avoided that way. So if you do ever get out, which might be in 30 plus years, 20 with good behavior, which I know you'll never get, let our paths never cross again. People like you are sick and will never change their way of thinking. I work for the local coroner's office. I went out on my first in 2019, shortly after being hired. I was expecting to remove bodies after people dying in nursing homes or murder victims. The call came from the police station in fall 2019 that there was a body to be removed and it was going to be a bit more of an intense job. The information we were provided in order to prepare for this job went something like this. Man, in his mid-80s, living alone, died in his rented home. His family had not heard from him in weeks and had called the police office in his area and requested a welfare check. The man had died on his bedroom floor weeks prior to being found. Foul play was suspected due to the condition of the body, but responding police officer might not be familiar with the decomposition process. The landlord wants the home cleaned up immediately and is wanting to fill it with new occupants as soon as possible. We packed the van with everything we're going to need. The gurney, body bag, cleaning materials, and we suit up in the necessary biohazard suits. I wasn't dreading this pickup, hoping he passed peacefully and his remains would make for easy cleanup. We arrive at the house. It's a small home with a lovely front yard. The automatic sprinklers were going. The house was painted a very light avocado green color with white trim. There was a red Prius in the driveway. The welcome mat said, "Hello." The front door is white with a large oval pane of carved glass. The coroner punches in the code on the large door lock and we enter the home. Immediately, even with the biohazard suit on, I am assaulted with the smell. The house is clean, aside from the pile of mail on the kitchen counter. His recliner was brown and the TV was large. Next to the recliner is a dog bed, a very, very large navy blue dog bed. We announce ourselves and proceed. The spare bedroom, the bathroom, a closet, then we hit the master bedroom. The coroner opens the door and we're hit with a more intense wave of stench. His body was lying face down in the light carpet. The top of his body was white, completely drained of blood. The underside was purple. His eyes were sagging toward the floor, mouth open, but the tongue was not loose or flopping out of the mouth. A thought popped into my mind and I quickly ushered it out. Was it missing? No, no way. The floor surrounding his body was stained with the brown liquid that leaks from a body when it begins to really start decomposing. His hair is white, he was wearing khaki cargo shorts and a forest green polo-style shirt. There is a walker about 3 feet in front of the body with tennis balls on the bottom of the front 2 legs. The body is sagging into the floor like it was made of putty. There were flies. The coroner takes photos of the body from the doorway. There is a deep gurgling, growling sound from the corner of the room on the other side of the bed. The coroner curses loudly and jumps as if startled. There's a massive white Great Dane in the corner of the room. The dog's snout is stained brown with the fluid of the man's body. The dog had been eating his deceased owner. The dog was starving and had been eating its deceased owner to survive. The dog stands and walks towards the side of the room we were standing in, growling. The collar around the dog's neck makes a tinkling sound as it moves. The dog is looking at me with bright blue, icy eyes. He's massive. In height, he measures up to my chest at least, and I'm not a small person. We back out of the doorway and shut the door as fast as possible and exit the home. The coroner phones the responding police officer and we leave the room and wait for the dog to be removed. The dog apparently was there to protect the old man. We re-enter the home and get to work. The coroner does not start, but orders myself and my coworker to start. The man's body did not come onto the gurney in one piece. He fell apart. The head and the remaining left leg and foot below the knee were first, then the legs below the hips, the arms, then the torso, if you could even still call it that. The coroner goes to the side of the bed the dog was previously in and tosses the right leg and separated foot that were chewed up in the corner into the body bag, more cursing. Each part of the man's body that was left was sheared and ripped at the seams, thanks to Mother Nature and the helping hand of the guardhound. The fluid rushed out of the man's body and further stained the carpet. I didn't feel scared, but I felt a sense of dread knotting in my stomach. The energy in the room felt thick and heavy, weighing down on my neck and shoulders. We zip the bag and transfer it into the gurney, lift the gurney and wheel him out. We loaded the gurney into the van and the coroner lights up a cigarette and asked what we planned on for lunch. I felt like gagging. The eyes of the dog come to me at night sometimes. Even though we met early in the morning, the man's adult daughter and her family own him now. I wonder if he thinks of the old man. I quit my job after the one call. I couldn't get the smell off of my body for what seemed like forever, even though my skin only ever came into contact with the air in his home. On April 24th, just a couple of weeks ago, my boyfriend and I drove from Minnesota down through Iowa and Nebraska to Colorado for a family emergency. We made a pit stop, trying to leave exact locations out of this, to stretch our legs and also so I could look for rocks for a little bit. I found a wooded area near a park that had shallow runoffs from the large river nearby. It was about 6 p.m. and I'd never been to the area before, so I put on my rain boots and rock hunting gloves, made my way down this little hill and into the woods. The boyfriend trailed behind me a bit. This place looked like it had been flooded recently, and maybe some kind of overflow area for the nearby rover because there was a lot of debris, garbage, and downed trees that were smooth from traveling down the larger river. So I'm walking around, examining the ground looking for some rocks when I see this men's athletic shoe that still had a sock in it, in the bank of a shallow runoff. My first thought was, What if there's a foot in that shoe? I doubt it, but I've got to look. So I walked to the shoe to inspect it. Inside there was what I thought might have been some rocks, twigs, dirt, and leaves. Figured maybe someone stepped in some mud and lost their shoe and sock. I mean, I've lost a shoe while rock hunting before. It's weird that the sock was still in it, but who knows? There was a lot of random stuff in the area. I guess I spent a total of 1 minute looking at the shoe. So I continue my search for rocks, and a little further up this runoff I see a bone that I picked up to show my boyfriend to ask what kind of bone it was and how creepy it would be if it was a human bone. I honestly didn't think it was actually a human bone because I definitely wouldn't have picked it up. I assumed it was an animal bone, and I figured the odds of it being human were slim to none. My boyfriend said, "Oh, it's probably just a deer bone or something." So I dropped it and kept looking for rocks. Didn't find any, and we went back to the car, and the rest of the details of the trip don't really matter. I think we were in this area for about 30 minutes in total. So flash forward to last night, back home in Minnesota. I was lying in bed scrolling through Facebook and came across this news article from a true crime page that I follow. The title said something along the lines of this: "Body of missing person found in Iowa. Cause of death still under investigation." My blood went cold. Having not even opened the article to read the location or any of the other details, I just had this gut feeling. I instantly thought of the shoe with the sock in it and the bone that I had seen and picked up just 2 weeks prior. So I clicked on the article, and as I'm reading it, I see that the body of a person who went missing over the winter was found along the bank of the large river at the park that I was rock hunting at. And the case remains unsolved. I hardly slept last night because I had this overwhelming feeling that the shoe and bone might have belonged to that person. I called the police department that was handling the case and explained to the dispatch lady everything that I wrote above. The tone in her voice changed, and I could tell that she was crying and told me that this case has kept her up at night. She had me send an email with photos I took from the area and Google Maps aerial screenshots where exactly I was. She thanked me for calling and said that the head detective on the case would be calling me in the next 2 days. I can't stop thinking about this whole thing. I really hope that my findings will be able to give some sort of clue as to what happened to this person. This happened to me about 13 years ago when I was 16 years old. I remember staying overnight at a hotel and casino with my mom. It was on a random weekday night and the hotel was pretty quiet. We just shopped all day and had something good to eat before going up to the room for the night. As soon as we got in, we realized we forgot to get drinks before going back to the room. I had to go back downstairs and get them by myself. I got what I needed from downstairs and quickly got into the elevator to go back to the room. As soon as I got in the elevator, one lone man stepped in. He looked like he was in his 40s, dressed in plain dark clothes wearing a baseball cap. I could feel him stare at me from the other side of the elevator, and he broke the silence with, "Are you a teacher?" I tried not to engage with him, but answered back politely, "No, I'm not old enough to be a teacher." Then the man replied, "Oh, because there's a teachers' convention going on and there's a lot of teachers around tonight." I thought that was strange because the hotel would usually be very busy and have a lot going on if there was a teacher conference going on. Then the man said, "I'm actually a director and I'm making a movie in the area." I just gave a simple, "Oh, cool," reply back as I tried to keep to myself. The elevator finally stopped at the floor that seemed like it was his. He was about to leave the elevator, but he stopped suddenly, turned towards me and asked, "Would you like a glass of wine?" I gave a stern, "No, thank you." At this point, I started to get nervous. The man kind of stood in the doorway of the elevator with hesitant body language and a hesitant look on his face, and then he asked, "Are you sure?" I backed up and held my finger over the door close button. I gave him a firm, "Yes, I am sure." He finally got out and started walking away, but suddenly he slowed down and looked over his shoulder at me in the elevator. He hesitated and seemed like he wanted to go back in the elevator. I could tell by the look in his face, his body language, and the way he kept hesitating that he was contemplating doing something sinister. It took me a while to realize how sketchy this situation really was. There wasn't any teacher convention going on that I knew of. He knew I must have been pretty young if I was not old enough to be a teacher. He could have been telling people he was a director to impress and lure women. And yeah, he could have been a director for some sort of seedy movie happening in one of the hotel rooms. Whatever that man was up to that night, I thank God he decided not to go through with it. This happened back in 2005. My ex and I were still together at this point, and we had an apartment in a 6-unit building. We were on the 2nd floor, only one door to enter or leave. One afternoon, my then-husband wanted to go over to the university campus to hang out at their library and check email and such, and asked if I wanted to come with him. I said no. I had a paper I had to write for a class and needed to get that done. He left, and I started getting settled in to do some writing when I hear the door open and shut again, and I thought he'd forgotten something and had come back, as he was only gone a handful of minutes. I had my back to the door, so I just assumed it was him. I asked, "Well, that was the shortest trek to campus and back. Everything okay?" I didn't get an answer, so I turned around, and it wasn't my partner standing there, but the neighbor who lived across the hall from us, standing in front of my door, the only means of escape I had. We live on the 2nd floor, and I'm not about to go jump out of a window should he try to tackle me. I'm only 5'2", and this guy is easily 6'3" and no slouch. In other words, he could take me down pretty easily. I snapped at him. "What do you think you're doing in my apartment, Jasper?" This guy has a serious schizoaffective disorder that requires heavy-duty medication. He'd been off his meds for some time, and our landlord was his carer. And when it was time for his monthly shot, he'd disappear for a while, thinking he'd avoid getting the dose. All he said to me was, "I just want a cigarette." My partner was a smoker more than I was, but I wasn't going to pilfer his smokes to give this guy anything. I just wanted him gone. He was fairly harmless for the most part, but he made me quite nervous because he is known for busting out all his windows out of his apartment in a psychotic rage one night, and subsequently did the same with the neighbors below him. So, you can understand why I didn't want to engage him. I snapped on him that he needed to leave or I was calling the landlord. He repeated himself again, and I again told him as I was reaching for the phone, "I'm going to ring the landlord if you don't get out of my apartment now." He took off, and we didn't see much of him after that. Ever since that afternoon, I keep my door locked at all times unless I know someone's on their way over and will be here shortly so they can just come on in, but they know to announce themselves. I ended up moving out of that apartment as soon as I could. So around this time last year, I was walking through the local 24-hour supermarket at 2 a.m. My boyfriend had decided he would like a bath, so I offered to go out and grab some girly stuff for him. Think bubbles, candles, face masks. I was perusing the soaps when a guy came uncomfortably close behind me and whispered, "I love your hair." I had bright pink hair at the time and often got compliments or disapproving stares, so I just nervously laughed and said thanks before moving to a different aisle. I thought it was creepy, but it was 2 a.m. on a Saturday, so I assumed he was drunk or whatever and moved on. I noticed him kind of following me around the shop, but put it down to him needing the same stuff as me, as I'd gone to get chocolate and sours, typical Friday night stuff. As I'm walking to the self-checkouts, a hand reaches out of the aisles next to me and tugs me round by the hood. I'm face to face, less than 10 centimeters away from the guy, and he absolutely stank of weed. I panic. My arms are full and I don't want to drop and smash the bottle of alcohol I picked up, so I just froze. "You're a little young to be buying alcohol, don't you think?" I just mumbled something back, terrified. "Maybe I should buy it for you. We can go sit in my van and have a drink, yeah?" I notice one of his hands, on the one that isn't holding my shoulder, looks like he's getting something out of his back pocket. Then, a screwdriver is being pointed at my face. I have tears starting to well up, and I'm on the verge of a panic attack when, like an angel, Brian tackles the guy. Brian works nights on the customer service desk, and he's known me since I was born. Not like a close family friend, but enough to care about me. Brian has the guy on the floor and tells me he's called the police. He says they got it all on camera and I can just take my stuff and go. He'll sort it out with the managers. I left, thoroughly shaken up. I put all my stuff in my bag and called my boyfriend to meet me halfway when I walked back. I spoke to Brian again about 2 weeks later, and he said the guy was on parole and ended up back in prison, as well as being permanently banned from that store. When I was about 7 years old, I lived in a medium-sized brick house at the entrance of a fairly normal suburban neighborhood. The neighborhood itself was fine. There were a lot of kids and the neighbors were nice. There was never any trouble and everyone got along, which is why I'm so surprised something so horrifying almost happened to me right in my front yard. It was a normal Saturday morning and my mom was out mowing the lawn. She had finished mowing the biggest portion of our front yard. I came outside and sat down in the grass and played with some of my toys since it was so nice out. One thing about this house was that there were 2 giant bushes at the entrance of the driveway, big enough for a person to hide behind without being seen. My mom was behind one of the bushes, picking sticks out from around it so she could mow. As she was doing that, a man with gray hair and a baseball cap came walking by. When he saw me, he stopped and started talking to me. We were so far away enough from my mom that if she was zoned out or focused on one thing, she wouldn't have even acknowledged us, and the man couldn't see her from behind the bush, so he thought I was all alone. He starts talking to me, asking me what my name was, what I was doing, how my day was. Seemingly normal questions. But as he's doing so, he starts slightly inching towards me from where he was walking on the side of the road. I noticed it, but it didn't bother me that much. We were talking, and I guess my mom must have finally noticed I was talking to someone because she began walking out from behind the bush and over toward me. She started talking to the guy, and he backed up on the side of the road since he had wandered a few inches into our yard. They were talking, and one thing I picked up on, even as a kid, was how my mom seemed rather uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be talking to this guy. And my mother has always been a very social person. The guy continued on with his walk, and I didn't see him again after that. My mom let me stay outside, but had me play closer to the house. About a week later, my best friend's mom texted me and told her that some guy had just gotten out of prison and had moved to our neighborhood. Due to the things that he was in for, she told my mom to keep a good eye on me and my brothers from now on. Then she sent her a picture of the guy so she knew who to look for. It was the same guy that had been talking to me a week ago. My mom was horrified and told me that if I see that man again to stay away from him. When I asked why, she said that he's done some very bad things. When I was younger, I didn't understand, but now I do. And it scares me to think what this guy would have done or tried to do if my mom wasn't there with me. We don't live there anymore, and I don't know what became of that man, but I just hope that he never got what he wanted. And I warn anyone reading this, stranger danger is rung into our ears for a reason. Please, be careful. Back in May of 2012, when I was in my senior year of high school, my school joined up with another school for a trip to the UK. It was honestly the adventure of a lifetime, but there was one night in Scotland that I cannot explain, and I certainly will never forget. We had worked our way through England and into Scotland, toured around Edinburgh, and went venturing north into the Scottish Highlands, where we would be spending a few days before returning to Glasgow to catch our flight back to Canada. It was really nice to be up there, as up until this point in the trip, we had been mostly exploring bustling cities and doing all the usual tourist activities of the UK, so it was nice to spend a few days just relaxing and taking in the natural beauty of northern Scotland. The place our tour guide had picked out for us to stay was perfect. It was a resort in this absolutely beautiful valley which housed one of the many lakes in the area. Being the off-season, we pretty much had the place to ourselves, and when we weren't out exploring the surrounding countryside, we would be playing soccer in this large field a little ways from the main hotel building, or sitting around the fire pit talking about stupid teenager stuff. There was a girl from the other school that I had had my eye on ever since the trip began. Her name was Brooklyn. She was a tall, skinny brunette with gorgeous eyes, pretty much the most beautiful girl 17-year-old me had ever seen. I really hadn't been able to get close to her yet, as when we split off into groups for the day trips, her and I never seemed to end up in the same one. Now that we were on a less structured schedule, I figured this was my chance to get to know her. At first, I tried the direct approach by sitting down next to her around the fire the first night and introducing myself. She said hi, but quickly just blew me off and went back to talking with her friends. Somewhat defeated, I got up to go grab something from my room and rethink my strategy. I don't consider myself to be a terrible-looking guy, but compared to Brooklyn, I may as well have been Gollum from Lord of the Rings, so I knew I'd have to try extra hard to impress her. I was suddenly snapped out of my trance with her as I heard a shrieking sound at the window of my room. It sounded like a woman screaming, and initially gave me goosebumps until I realized what it was. It sounded like the whistle of an old steam locomotive. I figured there must have been a heritage railway around here somewhere since the UK is full of them, but it was odd as I wouldn't have thought that they would run trains this late. I did remember seeing what I thought was a railway track on the other side of the field near the resort though, so it wasn't too out of the ordinary. I quickly forgot about it and made my way back down to the fire, and by this point a lot of other students had paired off into impromptu couples of the night. Fortunately for me, Brooklyn was sitting by herself on a bench on the opposite side of the fire from most of the other kids. I sat back down next to her and tried to pluck up some courage to talk to her again after my previous failed attempt. She jumped a little as I said hi, as if she hadn't even noticed me sit down. I apologized for startling her and asked if she was okay. She didn't reply, but I could tell by the way she was looking at the guy across from her cuddled up with another girl that she wished it was her over there. We talked for a little bit, and then I asked her if she wanted to take a walk. I had remembered the railroad track I had seen earlier and figured it would be pretty romantic to take her out there and watch the midnight freight trains roll by. She somewhat begrudgingly agreed. I don't think she really wanted to go, but I guess she wanted an excuse not to think about her crush and another girl together. It was awkward at first, trying to keep the conversation going as we walked, but she started warming up to me gradually as the night went on. We found a spot to sit by the railway tracks, and soon there was the distinctive rumble of an approaching train, followed by the iconic two-tone air horn sound of British diesel locomotives. We sat there and watched the train slowly roll by, and just as the last car disappeared around the corner, the clouds in the sky completely cleared, revealing the brightest full moon I'd ever seen. We sat for another hour, and no more trains passed by. Brooklyn then mentioned that she was cold, and I had to admit the temperature had seemed to drop significantly after the clouds had cleared, so we began to get up when she grabbed me and said, "What was that?" I listened, and far off in the distance, I heard the same shrieking noise that I had heard earlier. I was about to brush it off and tell her that it was just another train when it struck me that it was almost 1 a.m. at this point. The first time I had heard it was probably about 9:30, but there was no way a heritage railway was running a steam train this late into the night. I told her it was probably a coyote or something, even though I have no idea if they have those in that part of Scotland or not, and We began walking back along the tracks toward the road that led back to our resort. It was getting colder by the second, it seemed, which was really weird as the weather had been so warm just an hour ago and there wasn't a cloud in the sky to signal an impending storm. As we neared the embankment we had climbed down from the road earlier, I noticed that I could see my own breath in the night air. I turned to look at Brooklyn, and she had noticed the same thing I had. "Better get inside," I said. "There's got to be some bad weather coming." Truthfully, I had no idea what was going on, but it was the only reasonable thing I could think to say. Then the shrieking came again, and it was a lot closer this time. Brooklyn and I jumped and cowered together Scooby-Doo style for a second, which made us both chuckle a little bit at how on edge we were. Then we heard what sounded like rapid, deep breathing approaching us from behind. I turned around and saw a white cloud of steam maybe 500 feet down the tracks behind us. Emerging out of it was a blue steam locomotive pulling some extremely outdated-looking freight cars. "I thought they didn't use steam trains anymore," Brooklyn said to me nervously. "They don't," I quietly replied, while keeping my eyes fixed on the train. Even though there was a fence between us and the tracks, I felt like we needed to get further away. But my morbid curiosity got the better of me and I walked a little bit closer to the tracks. I figured it's a train. It's not like it can come off the tracks and hurt me, right? Brooklyn stayed further back as I approached the fence. The train was approaching fast and the sound was getting louder. It was a beautifully decorated blue locomotive with the letters CR painted on the tender on each side of what appeared to be some kind of coat of arms. It let out a deafening shriek and the engineer waved his hat at us as the train passed by. We were also blasted with the coldest wind we had ever felt, which made me finally retreat away from the train tracks. We began to run since we were now freezing, and by the time Brooklyn and I had made it back up the hill to the road, there was no sign of the train anymore and the clouds were beginning to return as well as the warmth. When we got back to the resort, our tour guide was outside having a smoke. He asked us how our walk had been, and we decided not to mention the mysterious train, but we did mention that it had gotten cold when the clouds had cleared up. He looked at us funny and said it had been warm and overcast all night as far as he had noticed. Brooklyn and I said goodnight and went to our rooms. I stayed up a little while longer on my laptop trying to see if there were any local legends of ghost trains in the area. There were none, which didn't surprise me. It didn't really strike me as a ghost train, though, as the peculiar thing about it was that it was so outdated and the sudden cold snap as it passed by. From my research, I did uncover the CR stood for the Caledonian Railway, and that the engine I had seen was an 812 class, which were built in the late 1800s and were used in the region up until the 1960s. These locomotives were actually the basis for the characters of Donald and Douglas from the Thomas the Tank Engine TV show, and one of them, number 828, actually has survived into preservation and been restored to working condition. I don't think the restored engine is what I saw that night, though. I doubt it would have been running that late at night, and also number 828 was supposedly in England at the time according to Wikipedia. Plus, even if it was number 828, that still doesn't explain the cold snap it seemed to bring with it. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but I believe what we saw that night was not from this world. I know that sounds insane, and trust me, it is, but I can't think of any other explanation. It wasn't transparent or spooky looking or anything like what you would have expected a ghost to look like. It looked exactly like how I would imagine it had looked when it was still in service. So real and normal looking, yet also very unsettling by its mere presence outside of its time period. I don't believe that the train or its crew has any malicious intent, as the engineer seemed rather friendly as he waved to us. I believe it might be the spirits of the old railwaymen who used to ride on these rails back when steam power still ruled the world. Brooklyn just pretended the whole night never happened. I don't think it was out of fear of the possible ghost encounter, but rather to stop rumors of us hooking up from spreading. Her and I did talk about it the next morning in private, and she did admit to me that she had heard the whistle shrieking again while she was laying in bed. It was unsuccessful in getting her number, though, so after we got back to Canada, I never saw her again, even though we only lived half-hour apart. If you're ever in Scotland near a railway light at night, and the clouds suddenly part and the temperature starts to fall, be on the lookout for a blue Caledonian steam locomotive and its crew as they ride into the night delivering their cargo to a destination likely beyond our world. I grew up in a loving home. My parents were wonderful, and my sister and I were and are the best of friends. I've always been a bit reserved when it comes to sharing my feelings, and so even though my family would have been an awesome support system to me, I rarely confided about things that I should have. I suffered from panic attacks in the night, anxiety about everything, and depression for most of my life. I vividly remember having my first panic attack at the age of 2. I never really mentioned any of my anxieties and depressions until I was a teenager and began to realize that other people didn't struggle the way I did. The more my parents have realized what I was going through internally, all the while presenting as their good little girl, the more upset with themselves they have become. But it was never really their fault for not noticing. I covered it all up because I didn't want to appear weak when I was fearful, and because I didn't know anything different when I didn't feel other emotions. My father was a pastor of a small Baptist church in a small Texas town that felt like dust and boredom. We lived in the parsonage, a house provided by the church that was catty-cornered across 2 intersecting roads. The church itself was an overwhelmingly creepy place. Me and my sister still have nightmares about the vacant and ominous second story, and the winding corridors that creak and moan. But the parsonage, by all logic, was a cozy 3-bedroom cottage. Even after all the weird events that took place there, I still look back on it with fondness, slightly tinged with uneasiness. Of the 2 kids' bedrooms, I somehow got the bigger one. My sister, older by 7 years, had first pick but chose the smaller. She said she just liked it better. I never, and I mean never, have had a restful night's sleep in the larger room. My room. Most always, I would end up sleeping in my sister's room or on the floor of my parents' room or the living room. I cannot pinpoint what it was about that room other than a strange dark spot on my ceiling. It was right above my head, and as I stared at it to fall asleep, I swear it would slowly grow bigger. An ominous feeling would grow and grow until I couldn't stand it anymore and would leave my room. Mind you, it would sometimes take hours for me to work up the courage to move. My bedroom also looked down a curved hallway to my parents' room, and as scary as it was to see shapes moving in the dark hallway, hearing murmurs and whispers when everyone was asleep, the idea of shutting my door was more horrifying to me. I had a great dog. She was part coyote and part German shepherd, so there was no human who would ever hurt me and live to tell. But she was also very sensitive to everyone's feelings around her. Many nights, she would sit protectively in front of me and growl at seemingly thin air. She would stare and track things in the distance that no one else could see. She wore a jingly collar that could be heard all around the house. One time, we had just gotten back from a week-long trip. I popped into the restroom, and I left the door open because the bathroom is the second most unnerving room in the house to me. While I was on the toilet, I saw my dog walk by the doorway. I could hear her jingly collar, and I called her to come back, but she ignored me. I called a couple more times before I remembered that my dog was at my family member's house for the week since we were away. Chills rushed over me. When I brought it up to my parents and sister, they said they often had similar things happen to them too because our minds show us the things we expect to see. So maybe that's all it was, but I have never had a trick of the mind be so vivid before or since. I had various other weird things happen to me. Hearing my name called when no one else was home, dreams accurately predicting step for step what would happen the next morning, even strangers knocking on my windows in the night. But by far the scariest things were the following 2. I've never fully recounted what actually happened on these nights for fear of how crazy I would seem. I probably will never recount them again either. I was about 10 years old. The day had not been anything unusual. I was getting along with my family just fine. Nothing bad had happened. We had just finished dinner and my mom had asked me to do the dishes. I was standing at the sink, my hands in the warm soapy water, humming a song when a chill raced down my spine. In a blink, I felt a brick settle in my stomach and a deep heaviness through my limbs. It was like my blood had turned to syrup. I felt something cold in my ear. I don't think I heard it audibly, but at least in my mind I heard, "You could do it, you know. No one would see it coming." I looked down and saw the large knife I was washing, and a horrendous scene filled my mind. Even now I can't wrap my mind around it. I'm struggling to say it. I saw myself hurting my family, my parents. It was so easy, so quick. Who would expect someone so small to do something so evil? But I could do it if I wanted to. I didn't want to, but then, did I? Why was I even thinking about these things? No, it was all so wrong. I was horrified and nauseous, but I couldn't let go of the knife. Inside, I was frantic, though if you were to look into the kitchen, you would have just seen a little girl in front of the sink standing still. I kept trying to let go of the idea, to let go of the knife, but my hands and mind wouldn't. I heard more whispers, horrible, horrible things. After a few moments, I started quietly crying and praying. Through clenched teeth, I mustered out, "In Jesus' name, I won't." And the knife finally fell from my hands back into the soapy water. I went and told my mom that I was about to throw up and couldn't finish the dishes. She was annoyed, I'm sure, but that was okay. I have never had such vile things come into my mind since that one time. It took a long time to come to peace with my role in this event, but I truly believe that I was under the influence of something else. I was not that kind of kid, and I knew even in the moment how insane and contradictory to my being it all was. Side note, my parents were really protective of me, so it wasn't like I was exposed to many negative things. I mean, my mom thought Willy Wonka would scare me. That whole experience has messed with me for a very long time, but by God's grace and forgiveness, I've gotten through it. The next scariest night, I was about 14 or 15 years old. Now, I want to be completely honest with you all. I was a very ill child. I was sick all the time. This night was no different. I was stuffy, runny, sneezy, and miserable. I took one Benadryl, and I had many times before with no side effects. I turned out my light to go to sleep, but sleep never came. By this time, my sister had moved out, and I had moved into the smaller, less uneasy room. I tossed and turned for about 30 minutes and ended up facing the wall, my back to the room. Slowly and softly, I started hearing an unintelligible chanting. It grew louder and louder, sounding like a choir. I couldn't make out any words I recognized. I told myself it was all in my head, but then a hand gently moved my hair behind my ear, exposing my bare neck. I froze in more fear than I ever knew I could feel. Loudly, there was one voice whispering over the rest in words I didn't know. I felt pressure on my shoulder, down my arm, and then the sway and curve of my hip like a long caress. I felt warm breath tumbling down my neck. Again, I started praying. The whole encounter felt evil and horrific. I worked up the courage to sit up and turn my lamp on. There was nothing there, but the voices continued, the chanting. I spent the night drawing, reading my Bible, writing, anything to distract me from the chorus of jumbled words, from thinking about what had been touching me, breathing on me. It was one of my longest nights, but eventually the words I was hearing faded as the sun started to come up, and I slept that morning for an hour or two. When I told a very small portion of this to my parents, we all agreed I must just be really sensitive to taking the Benadryl. That must be it, right? But I've taken it since then, and you know what happened? Nothing abnormal. No demon breath, no culty songs, no scary moments of any kind. So it was the sickness and the medicine, perhaps. A perfect storm for a night of misery, or was it something else? I will never know, and I probably don't want to. I've always been pretty intuitive. I am an INFJ for my Myers-Briggs friends and an empath, someone who can just naturally feel out places or people or situations in my gut. Now that I am older, I trust that about myself instead of brushing it off. It scares me to think of what was around me in that house in those frightening times. I moved out when I was 17 and only went back to visit a handful of times in the next 3 years. Nothing scary happened, but just a sense of uneasiness. When I was 20, my parents moved to a different house, but while I was writing this, I realized one last thing that happened right before they moved. The last time I stepped foot in the house was Christmas of 2012. My husband and I spent the night there for the holiday, and that was the night that I miscarried our first child. I live in a 5-story apartment, and exactly opposite to my apartment is another 5-story apartment complex. I live on the first floor, and from my bedroom balcony I get a clear view of the apartment unit of the complex exactly opposite to mine. Let's call the unit of the apartment exactly opposite to me Unit B. Now, a little backstory. In Unit B there used to live these 2 elderly women, both sisters and widows, who died when I was about 12 years old, and ever since no one had ever lived there. One had a daughter and was married, whereas the other woman had no kids. So one night I was up late studying when I decided to take a 15-minute break. It was a hot summer night, so I thought I would just sit in the balcony for a bit to relax. While I was chilling out, I saw something move in the window of Unit B in my peripheral vision. I instantly look towards the window and see nothing. I keep looking at the window for about 2 to 3 minutes. Nothing. I sit back on my chair and continue to scroll through my phone, and while I'm about to leave, I take a quick glance at the window, and there she is. A woman dressed in a white kurta, long black hair, and a dead look on her face. Not any of the old ladies who used to live there. And as soon as she sees me, she turns around and away from the window. I was a little scared and instantly ran back into my bedroom and closed the balcony. At this time, it was about 2:45 to 3 a.m., and we've all heard about the witching hours, so I decided to sleep. While in bed, I keep thinking about the woman and who it could possibly be. The next morning, I talked to my mom about it, and she brushed it off by saying it might be someone from their family just checking on the house. This happened in the middle of a nationwide lockdown, and who on earth would come at 3 in the morning to check if the house is fine? The same night when I told my mom about this, I decided to stay up and see if I saw anyone again. Nothing. I saw nothing. I saw nothing until a few days later. Same story. Me chilling on my balcony, staring at Unit B's window when I see the same woman appear from somewhere within the apartment. Didn't really understand from where, and stand in front of the window looking down at the empty street. And when I called out for her, she just went back in. I told my mom again, and she told me that she has the contact number of the daughter, we'll call her Jen, of one of the old ladies who live there. I called Jen to ask her about the whole situation, and she informed me that she was in, I don't want to mention the place, but it was about 12 hours away from where I lived. So I asked her if she has given the keys to someone, and she hasn't. Jen instead told me the story of a young girl who used to live in Unit B with her parents before them. This was in the 70s, probably. She was in love with a boy, unmarried and pregnant. Where I live, being pregnant before marriage is a taboo, and in the 70s it was even worse. And because of societal pressure and what people would say, she took her own life. Jen also mentioned that the 70s girl made her presence known to Jen and her family when they used to live there, but was always harmless. And Jen thinks I probably saw the girl who took her own life. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.